have neither pockets nor waistband, so I get to hold my microphone back. Get to pretend it's a remote. I'm Jessica Parsons. I am a developer support and documentation engineer at Netlify. We are a tool set for the modern web, which is a fancy way of saying a static site host and deployment platform that lets you do a whole bunch of really cool stuff, like have free HTTPS on custom domains and deploy previews for all of your PRs when you're connected repos. It's pretty cool, but one of the reasons why I mention it too is that most of what I do is in front-end projects that don't have a connected back-end. And some of that kind of applies to some of these things later on. If you want to follow along with the slides, they're at slides.com/verythorough/shiba-images. And this is the Smart Shibas Guide to Images on the Web, with help from my dogs, Monty and Petunia. That is Petunia, doing one of her favorite things. And that's Monty. So why does it matter with images? Images actually make up about 60% of the web. And that's a lot out of your web projects. And if you can make 60% of your web project faster, that makes a pretty big difference. You can use things like fast hosting and CDNs that serve the content close to the customers and the people who are accessing your projects. But that only gets you partway there. Reducing your file size and making it load the smallest possible size that you need is what will really help you finish the job. The thing is that you have to balance file size with quality, right? If you make them too small, then they start looking like crap. And so how do you find a way to balance those two things? So we break that into about 4 different areas for improvement. One is choosing the right format, and having the right file format for your images can make a really big difference. Coding for responsive images, so making sure that you're loading not loading gigantic sizes for small screens. Doing things with the server settings that can make it so that your images load faster. And then also things that have to do with your workflow or outside services. And we'll get to all 4 of those. So at the first one, file level improvements. Choosing the right format, optimizing compression, and choosing the right size are the 3 things we're going to talk about. Looking at formats. Which format is the right format to choose depends on the content of your image. They have different formats, have different features, and so you want to pick the features that fit with the content that you have in your file. Again, these all balance the file size with the image quality. And I'll also be telling you about some of the newer formats that are kind of out there on the horizon and how those might sort of change how we do that. So starting with one of the first cases, and probably the most common, well, yeah, probably the most common still, would be photos. And with photos, you'll want to use JPEGs, generally speaking, as the ideal format for that. And as an example, this is a picture of Petunia when she was 10 weeks old. And this JPEG is 77 kilobytes. And if I were to make that in a PNG, it looks pretty good. If I keep the quality pretty similar, it's a lossless file format. It's 240 kilobytes. So that's quite a bit bigger just by choosing PNG instead of a JPEG. Now, I can, and it's actually kind of hard to do, I can change the settings on how that PNG is saved. I can reduce the number of colors that it uses and do some other things to make it so that it is as small as the JPEG, and it's 77 kilobytes. But it looks significantly worse. And it's hard to tell on the projection screen, but you've really only got like 15 colors to work with. You have these big blocks of color. It's just really not feasible. So when you have a photo-like image, a lossy format like JPEG is really the way to go. Now, in our someday maybe category, I put in a bunch of these little slides that you can tell when it's got the blue background, it's not something you can use everywhere right now. So we do have some other JPEG formats. There's JPEG 2000, which is only available on Safari. And there's JPEG XR, which is only available on Internet Explorer and Edge. Firefox, Chrome, and Opera do not support either one of those. But they are better quality JPEGs with a smaller file size but you can only use them on those 2 browsers. And there aren't any plans to develop support for either any of the other 3 browsers to match with that. And all the example photos that I have with them are not actually the file type that I'm talking about because, well, many of them are not supported by Chrome. And so looking at the next file type, screenshots. So if you've taken a screenshot of a UI or something like that and you want to be putting it up on something, PNGs, unlike the photos, PNGs are the way to go for this. Here's an example of a screenshot taken of an alert. This particular PNG file is 3.7 kilobytes. And if I were to make that to look fairly comparable in JPEG, it's 13 kilobytes. Now, those are still pretty small numbers, but that is, in order of magnitude, quite a bit larger. And if you have a whole bunch of those, that's going to make a pretty big difference. And and you can see it on there in the image. You can't see it on the screen. This is a fair amount bigger, but if you look at the image quality on the screen, it's significantly worse because, and you'll have noticed this maybe when you see screenshots that have like little bits of like pixels around the type on a screenshot. You've got this big flat space of color and there's little artifacts in it. That is probably a PNG saved as a JPEG or something that should be a PNG saved as a JPEG. And so that is one of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're saving screenshots. Now, I could do a really, really, really high quality JPEG that matches the quality of the PNG, but it goes up to, oh, I'm sorry, I took it the other direction. So this one brings it down the same way I did before, down to the 3.7 kilobytes. And that one, you can actually almost see some of the little things even on the projection screen. It looks really bad. So definitely, PNGs are good for things that have big flat areas of color, which is very often like screenshots, but not always. So if the screenshot is more photo-like, then you might actually want to use a JPEG instead. This happens to be the secret Shiba ending to Silent Hill 2, that if you like do certain actions, you end up and find out that there's like a Shiba that was controlling it all. So moving on, animations. As far as the widely supported image formats go, if you want to have an animated image format file, the only choice you have is GIF. So this example as a GIF is a really big image file. It's 4,800 kilobytes if we're putting it in kilobytes to match the others, or 4.8 megabytes. And if I were to make that as a JPEG, it's a very nice small 48 kilobytes. It's 1/100th the size, but it doesn't animate, so that's not going to help us very much. So yeah, you're definitely going to be using that GIF. And I put down in here a handy tool that I like using when I'm making GIFs or editing GIFs or doing things with GIFs, EasyGIFs. EasyGIF.com I find very useful, so just a little note in there. Whoops. Yeah, that is what I want. Now, this is another someday maybe, and it's actually getting increasing support. I actually, when I updated these slides, had to add Chrome and Opera because those just got added in for support. And that's an animated ping. So it has the advantages of a PNG. It can have transparency, and it can also, it has a smaller file size than a GIF, and it supports more colors than GIFs do. And it's now supported in everything except for Edge. They have not indicated yet whether Edge is planning to support it, but I don't know, kind of starting to look like peer pressure there, so maybe. And there's a demo on here that is made by Mozilla, but you could actually also look for APNGs on any of those 4 browsers, and you can see them working in there too. And one thing to note is that they do still display something. They show a single frame when they're in a browser that's not supported. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what about video? Like, why am I putting these little short videos and GIFs anyway? And in fact, like, when you insert a GIF into like Twitter or Imgur or things like that, or Imager, I always want to say Imgur, they're actually converting it to a video file because video loads way faster, it's a smaller file, and that's all great. And the way that you would do that in your HTML for that is you use a video tag, and you put in a source, and you have to make sure that you have sources for each video type that gets supported in the different browsers. And then you'll have a video. And you can set it to autoplay and loop it and have it muted, and it's going to behave exactly like a GIF. Except, and also, it's very nicely 455 kilobytes, which is a lot smaller than that GIF was. But if you're putting it in a place where you need to have like only images, like, for example, you're putting it into a forum or adding it in other places where you can only put an image, you can't stick in this like HTML code. Or, for example, this slide presentation software. You can't just put this HTML code in there. It doesn't work. So in order to do that, oops, yep, there it goes. I had to actually host that video with that markup on a different site and put it in as an iframe onto this page, and then it still doesn't scale with the page. So obviously, videos are cool when you can totally control the markup. In places where you can't control the markup, you're still looking at the GIF or maybe the aping. Now, switching over to transparency, in many cases, PNGs are still going to be the way to go with that. So here's an example of a PNG, and it has a non-rectangular border around it, right? You've got transparent edges around the face. That one is 72 kilobytes. Now, I could do this in a GIF, and it's not a whole lot larger, but you can see there's a little halo around it. And that's because GIFs have transparency, but they only have off or on. A pixel is either opaque or it's transparent. And when you want to have soft edges on things, you have to have pixels that can be partially transparent. And pings support that, alpha transparency, and that's how you can get that nice border on the edge of things. This one, if you cut out the background on a light background and you keep it on a light background, it looks fine. And then you move it onto a dark background and you get that halo. And if you don't see them too much anymore, but if you do see an image that has a little halo around it, you'll know it's because it's a GIF and not a ping. Now, a JPEG gets super small, but it's not transparent, so that's not going to help you very much. I got really creative with that particular section of the thing. I had to make little circles for each one of those. But that's not the whole story. Now, there are actually other ways to do transparency, and in many cases can be useful. So icons and many logos, SVG can be a way to do it, and SVG now has full support. And here's an example. Now, the thing about SVG is like these PNGs back here, this would be kind of a complicated image for an SVG. It's got a lot of different things going on. SVGs are vector graphics, so they keep track of every path inside the image and have a path and a color set with it. That would be a lot of paths. This is at the far opposite end of the spectrum. That's one path going all the way around that little Shiba shape. And so this is perfect for an SVG. And actually, that's true for icons. And that's also true for logos and some relatively complicated line art types things. This SVG is 0.3 kilobytes. So that's pretty tiny. And if I were to make that as a PNG, it's 2.5 kilobytes. So it's quite a bit larger. And depending on the screen you're on, you might even see a little bit of a fuzzy edge on it. It's not as sharp as the SVG. The big difference is when I make those larger. Now, I scaled that up quite a bit, and I could keep scaling it up forever, and it's still got a nice sharp edge on it, and it's still the exact same size because it's vectors. It's just saying this is where the line is, this is how it's shaped. You can scale that as large or as small as you want. Whereas a PNG, it's a matter of pixels. It's a raster image. So it's saying this is what color the dot is at each point. And if you want to make it bigger, you got to give it more dots. And so this one is at this comparable size. You can even see that it's got a little bit of fuzziness on the edge. And it's still the 2.5 kilobytes. So it's still larger than the other, and it's starting to get fuzzy. Now, if I wanted to make it nice and smooth like the SVG, and I want to make a file that actually is that resolution instead of a scaled up version of the small one, then it bumps up to 4.3 kilobytes. So it's really quite a bit larger than that SVG. And so that's why SVGs work out well for that. Now, I did put another note for a handy tool. Vector Magic is a really cool one for if you have a shape and you want to convert it to a vector image. Vector Magic works really well at that. You can do it in Illustrator or other things like that. Vector Magic does work better, I find. But they will, if you do more than one, charge you for it. So, now, the first time I did this talk, someone talked to me afterwards and said, you know, there's another way you could do this, and you can mix SVG and raster images together. And he ended up making a blog post about it and telling me about it. And this is a combination of an SVG image mask. So it draws a path saying, this is the shape around the dog. And it uses that as a mask with a JPEG image so that you can get the best of both worlds, basically. The downside of this is it's kind of like the video tag. You have to have access to the markup for the site. You couldn't just put a setup like this into places where you could only insert an image. But it is pretty cool. And another thing made by the same people who made Vector Magic, Clipping Magic, clips the background from things, which can be also useful when you have something you want to get rid of, make the background transparent. The tool works pretty well. Now, bringing into some other image formats that are kind of on the horizon, WebP is one that Google has developed, and so should come as no surprise that it's supported on Chrome. It's also supported on Opera because they use the same rendering engine. It's pretty cool because it's lossless like PNG, or it can be lossy like JPEG. So it can have those JPEG advantages for photos, or it can have the PNG type advantages for big blocks of color. And it also animates like a GIF or like an aping. And it does all of that taking up less space. So it sounds pretty awesome. But some do criticize the quality of it. That last thing is a link to more information about it from Google. But if you look at the support, Chrome and Opera are the only ones that support it. Firefox and Safari have said sort of, well, maybe. They haven't completely said no, but it's not supported. And Edge is not supported either. So, another one that's kind of interesting is BPG, which stands for Better Portable Graphics. Some say that it does all the same things as WebP and even better. However, the downside to it is that it has a patent. And we kind of made a mistake with patents the first time around with GIFs. Those were actually patented, and it ended up being something that browser makers actually had to pay to be able to use GIFs in their browsers. And so now, like, generally speaking, browser makers, internet like standards people are all sort of like, I don't think I really want to work with any image formats that have patents, because then we have to deal with annoying licensing issues and things like that. So you can pretty much bet that Firefox is probably never going to support it, and I'd say it's pretty doubtful that any of them will. Another one that's been kind of interesting is FLIF, which stands for Free Lossless Image Format. It's now only 21 months old, which is starting to get a little older than it was, but it's still pretty young for an image format. And it claims to be even better at everything. So it does all of those things that all the other ones do, plus it's even smaller. It doesn't have any patents that we know of. There's that link also talks about what the format does and what's so cool about it. However, so far the browser makers are like, this is too new for me to feel like this is worth putting development time towards supporting it. So it's kind of one of those wait and sees. So once you've picked your image formats and you're picking the right one for the job, it really helps to optimize those images by compressing them. And some of the tools I like for that, TinyJPEG and TinyPing, which are the same site with two different addresses, are good for JPEGs and pings. SVG, SVGO is a great tool for that. There's a command line version, and you can tie it into your build process. And there's also a graphical version on the web, SVG-OMG. And you can just try putting an SVG in there and see how much smaller it gets. And you get to see the code and how it changes, especially if you have like a sketch file or something that you've saved as an SVG and you put an SVGO. It's like 75% smaller. There's so much extra stuff in the code for SVGs that are generated by illustration programs. Another tool you can use is page speed insights. So if you run your page through Google Page Speed Insights and it gives you information about things that you should fix, one of the things it'll tell you about if your images aren't optimized, it'll say, hey, you should do this. And then it's got this nice little link where it just says, download optimized image JavaScript and CSS resources for this page. And it'll just let you download a zip file of all the stuff that was on your page in optimized format. So that can be a handy manual way to do it. Another thing that comes down to it is choosing the right dimensions. You're not really maximizing things if you put a gigantic image on a tiny screen. And I've seen this happen before where people will set an image so that they have the 2x version, and they'll put in the marker that if this browser is using pixel doubling and they have a retina screen, then use the 2x image of the version, which makes it twice as big. Well, a lot of phones have retina screens. They don't need the double size version, even though they have a retina screen, because the screen is this big. So it's not that helpful. And so you don't want to make them download more pixels than they need. If you see an image on a site that's like slowly chunking in, it's probably because it's a really big image that's been scaled down on the site. So you definitely want to have then, if you have flexible layouts on your site, which usually on a responsive site you do, right? Sometimes that image is going to be this big, and sometimes that image is going to be this big. And with an SVG, you don't have to worry about that. They're infinitely scalable. But with a raster image, which would be all of the other image formats we've been talking about, you need to save multiple versions. And sometimes you'll have to think about, like, well, how many versions do I need? Because it might be all different sizes, and you're not going to save like 100 different versions of an image for 100 different possible widths. This tool, responsive breakpoints, is a handy one that you can look at, and you can say, like, OK, I want to have this many versions, or I want to go from this size to this size, and I don't want anyone to have anything that's more than 100 pixels too big or too small. And it'll tell you what sizes to make from that image. So it can be really handy for that. So if we've done all the things that we can to improve our images, what can we do in our code to improve the way that they load? We'll talk about responsive image dimensions, using those modern formats that aren't supported everywhere with fallbacks, and lazy loading with JavaScript. So, responsive image loading. You can do this now with source set and sizes attributes. There's actually a really great talk from SFHTML5 meetup by Eric Portis a few months ago that goes way deep into sizes and all the things that you can do with it. But this is a sample of a basic template. So you do it within a regular image tag, and you'll set a sizes attribute, and you'll say that, OK, this image where it's being called will never be larger than 700 pixels. And it's got, it'll never be larger than 700 pixels, and it will be 100% of the viewport width otherwise. And then you give it different sizes. And basically, instead of having to say, like, OK, at this size, give it this image, at this size, give it this image, you basically tell the browser, this is how I'm treating it in the CSS, because the images get loaded before it parses the CSS to paint the page. This tells it in advance in the image tag, this is how big it's going to be depending on the size of the browser. And the browser knows how big the window is, so it can tell you that much. And then it figures out, based on what you've told it, OK, this screen is only going to be 500 pixels wide. I'll pick this one that is, well, let's see, 509 pixels wide. That's kind of an odd number, but I'll pick that one. And oh, but actually, this browser is at 2x pixel doubling, so I have to get a bigger one, and I can pick up a larger one and use that in there. So that's basically how it works. Then the other parts of the image tag are the same as usual. You still have your regular source as a backup, and then an alt tag for accessibility on the image. And another handy tool, a linter for writing responsive image markup. Now, what about CSS background images? Because that's for inline images. In background images, you can use traditional media queries. So you can say, OK, a regular, generally speaking, I'm going to be using this size. And then if it's at least 401 pixels wide, I'm going to use the bigger size. Now, this doesn't always work like you'd expect. Depending on the way your markup is and your CSS is, sometimes the browser is going to load both of those images together. And Jake Archibald has a really great talk on that, which also is at SFHTML5. And then another possible future option that is in discussion for putting into the CSS spec is the image set property, which is kind of like using source set for background images. Now, that would be for choosing the right size. This is if you wanted to use those fancy new image formats that aren't supported in all the browsers. So you can still, this one uses the picture element. And so in that, you do something where you wrap around the image tag with a picture element. And you can say, I've got a picture element, and you can put multiple sources in there. So the first source would say, OK, I'm going to use a WebP image if you can support it. If you don't, use a different format. So it's actually kind of similar to the video tag that you could put in different video formats, and it'll choose which one it supports. In this one, you put in source tags for the different image types. I could put WebP, I could put JPEG 1000 or whatever. I could put different images, and the browser would pick the one that it can support. And then it has image as a fallback if it doesn't support any of them. And that goes back to a regular old JPEG, which everybody supports. And you can, if you really want to get complicated about it, combine them all together. So you can have picture and image with source set all together in one big thing. And that gets kind of complicated. So there's a couple of things that you can look at about that. The Opera developer documentation has a nice article with some code recipes of things for using responsive images. The browser support for picture and source set and sizes are pretty good, but not quite universal. It's like older versions of Android, Opera Mini, and Edge, and Internet Explorer, but I don't even talk about that with all these new things because they're not in development. Then there's always, in all of these different things, if you're using picture, if you're using source set and sizes, any of those, you do have a built-in fallback to the source attribute. So you can, in the image tag or in the picture tag, just put a source attribute, and it will fall back and use that. But if you do that, it's one size fits all, right? So you want to, when you have that one as the fallback, you're picking like one image size for all of the different sizes of your browser. So that's one downside to that fallback. But since browser support is mostly supported in all of the desktop browsers, you could just put a small one in there. It's kind of a trade-off. Then you can also use a polyfill. So picture fill is a great polyfill. There's a couple of caveats with that, which first off, if you include a source fallback with using picture fill, you might end up having two images load when you only need one. It'll get the one that gets loaded with the JavaScript by picture fill, as well as the one that you linked with the source tag. And if you don't include the source fallback, then all of your image loading requires JavaScript. And so if you're not loading JavaScript, you don't get any images. Then lazy loading is another option, and it does certainly make it easier. There's a great JavaScript library for it called Lazy Sizes. You don't have to write those complicated tags, so it's a lot easier to develop. And it does have a great initial load because it doesn't load all of your images at once. It loads the ones above the fold and then gradually adds the other ones further down the page. Of course, the JavaScript has to load first, so you are waiting for that loading. Another con to that is that the image loading is JavaScript dependent again. So when you do that, then if you don't have JavaScript, you don't have images. So we've talked about what you can do to fix the images, what you can do in your markup to get the right images to the user. There are some things you can do on the server, gzip compression and cache headers. Now, if you're like me and you're working mostly in front-end only projects that are served on a static host and connect to backends with an API or something like that, you might not have, and actually even if you're on a lot of traditional web hosts, you might not have control over those server settings. And if you don't, well, then one of the ways that you can account for making sure that you have these good server settings is by choosing a host that does those things for you. So one of the things is gzip compression. And most hosting services now will provide this automatically. You can check your site at checkgzipcompression.com. That's pretty tough to remember. And it'll tell you just yes or no whether you've got gzip compression running on your site. And that's my little photo illustration of it. That is how gzip works, that it looks for similar bits and basically duplicates them and says, like, OK, there's multiples of this. Just use it again and again. But I don't recommend you actually do it with docs. And another thing is browser caching. And that link links to a really nice description of that from Google's developer documentation. What browser caching, you have to kind of weigh two things. It's a matter of balancing load speed, which is loading from the user's browser cache. So if they've been to the site before and they've already downloaded the image and it's saved on their computer, it's going to load a lot faster than if they have to download it. But the trouble with that is that you have to balance that with currency, which is if you changed that image and they're loading from their cache, they're not going to see the new version of your image. So that's where your cache settings balance those two things. So some hosts will compromise that by choosing a shortish, like a few hours max age. So they'll say, this image is only going to be, only trust it for 6 hours. So if you've been here within the last 6 hours, you can assume that the image hasn't changed. But if it's been more than 6 hours, go get the image again. If another thing you could do is set a long max age and change the file names. And so some sites will do this, like Cloudflare will do this, for example, when they attach that big long number to the end of the file name. So what they're doing is they set a max age that says, keep caching this file all the time for a really, really long time. If you've downloaded this file before, you can trust that it's going to be OK still. But they change the file name every time. So if you upload a new version of like shiba.jpg, it's going to actually change that file name to shiba blah, 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 a whole bunch of numbers.jpg that's different from the last version of shiba.jpg. So when it gets to the browser, it's going to say, oh, this is a totally new image. I can't load this from cache. I'm going to get a new one. One other strategy for doing that, and this is what Netlify happens to use, is we set a max age of 0. So it says always check, but it requires e-tag validation. So what it does with that is it says it has a tag next to it. It's not in the file name, it's in the header. And it says, like, it basically tags the image itself. And if that tag is different and it doesn't validate, then it knows it needs to get a new one. But if it's not, it just keeps the one that's in the browser cache. And there's an explanation there. So you can also check this inside of your browser. This is in Chrome's developer tools. You can check it in PageSpeed Insights, which will tell you, hey, you should be using better caching. Or it'll say, hey, your caching is really great. So that's one easy way to do it. And then another way is inside Chrome's developer tools. You can open that up, go to the network tab, make sure that disable cache is not checked. Then within that, go to the image tab, and then you can select an image on the side, and it'll tell you what those headers are. So down this part here where it says response headers, and it has that E tag. That's the tag that I was talking about that it checks. And then under cache control, it says max age 0. So it might say like max age some gigantic number, and you know that they're using the strategy where they make it really long, or it might be something that amounts to like 6 hours. This particular one adds that must revalidate, which is where the E tag comes in. So you can check which type they're using. And if you look at that Google developer documentation link, that will talk about the different types of caching. And then you can look in your dev tools and see which type of caching your host is using. Last, workflow improvements. So talking about automation and asset management. And this can get interesting with front-end projects. So with automation, generating and optimizing multiple image sizes is time-consuming and error-prone. Now, you can put it into your build tools to a degree, but sometimes it depends on how that image is going to get used in different contexts, and so it can get kind of complicated. There are actually lots of tool options. Some of them are things that happen at build time. Some of them are things that happen server-side. That spreadsheet has a whole list of a whole bunch of them, and when you look at them, Some things to think about are, does it require server-side code? Is it something that you can run at build time? So is it something that you can run when you run your build script? Or is it something that runs server-side? So are you going to have to be running a server that's resizing your images on the fly when people try to get to them? Another thing to think about, is it hosted by a service? So sometimes those images are stored elsewhere. You're not storing your images. You send them off to somewhere else. And then if they are there, are they building them dynamically based on numbers that you put in? Is there a fee for it? Those are things to think about. Another thing to think about with these services is sometimes they're using JavaScript to load them, and sometimes they're not. And that may or may not be something that you want to be using in your setup. So if you look for it, a lot of times if they tell you the way that you include the images by using data-source instead of just plain source, that's usually a pretty good clue that they're using JavaScript to load the images. Another thing to think about is asset management. Storing multiple images sizes inside of a Git repo can be really awful. It'll make it slow to clone, slow to upload, and it's just not made for that. It's really not made for large binaries. You can use Git LFS, and that helps some, but it's kind of weird. In the end, you're going to have really huge diffs, because unlike code where you change one line and it basically says, hey, a line changed. In an image, if you change one pixel, it saves a whole other copy of the image. It doesn't get that little diff. So generally speaking, when you start making a project that's stored in a Git repo and you need to keep making changes to it, putting all of your images into it doesn't scale super well. So if you are, another thing you can do though is have like one version of each image, which still eventually you're going to hit scaling issues, and then generate those image variants at build time. But again, that's going to make for really slow builds. Another option is to use standard asset stores like Amazon S3 or things like that. Setup for those can be difficult, and the workflow at this point usually is fairly manual. There are also services out there, like Cloudinary is one that is pretty easy to use. And if you're doing it at a small scale, it's free. If you're doing it at a large scale, it gets super expensive. So, but it does a lot of really neat stuff. And you can just include your images, and it links to them, and it resizes them on the, well, not on the fly, but it resizes them for you and stores all of them. And so it's pretty handy for that. And so looking to the future, I think it's kind of interesting in terms of the way that we're developing things, and a lot of times now it's Git-centric workflow. We're using things that are very often front-end, stored as a static site host, pre-built at build time. And it changes kind of the way that we deal with some of our images. And it also changes, we're looking at new image formats that might be changing that. And I'm interested to see what happens next with those. And I also like just having this picture of Petunia in there. So that's it. Thank you. And that's the address for my slides. And I'm on Twitter and GitHub and pretty much everywhere as very thorough. I'll avoid making the joke about being thorough about it. And that's Petunia and Monty dressed up as a zombie and a plant for my nephew's Plants vs. Zombies themed birthday party. So that's it. So.
Really great presentation, by the way.
Thanks.
I learned a lot. I actually like doing a lot of image optimization for a lot of my projects now, because I realized I did it horribly before.
You're not alone, so don't feel bad.
Yeah, no. Do you have any thoughts about maybe what's coming for the future? It seems like I find it ironic that GIFs are like kind of the most popular way that people sort of like visual entertainment on the internet. Yet it's like it seems like a really
terrible ancient technology.
Right? Do you see anything coming in the future to kind of replace that, or does it seem like it's going to be around for the future?
I mean, in some ways, actually, interestingly enough, the companies that host a lot of those GIFs are actually behind the scenes, like replacing it. You just don't know it. So when you put a GIF up on Imager, and they have, sometimes you'll see it, and it'll say like GIF-V as the file format. GIF-V is not a real file format. It's just something that they use as like a shortcut for what is actually a web video. And so some of the solution comes in there, is that the places that are hosting it, they're just on the back end converting that GIF to a video and serving it as a video, which is better. Apings are also definitely better, and they are getting really good support now. But I mean, I don't know how much people are going to say like, oh yeah, there's an aping for that. But like, I think in the end, it's probably mostly going to be happening on the back end, because most of the time people are going to be using GIFs. It's when they're uploading them to some other service. And if you're actually developing and putting something into your stuff, I think people are going to be moving more to putting video in. So.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know if this is within the scope, but if you feel comfortable with it, can you explain like briefly how a retina screen
Oh,
works?
sure. Yeah. So this is kind of an interesting thing, because actually for a long time, as laptops kept developing, very many Windows machines actually had really, really high resolution screens. But people started complaining about those things and said like, well, I like this high resolution screen, but like everything's so small on it. Like my icons are small and my fonts are tiny and all this stuff, and they didn't like that. And partly for that reason, a lot of Mac laptops and things like that didn't have really high resolution stuff because it made everything small. And so then they suddenly came up with this amazing idea, which is to still have a high resolution screen, but just make everything twice as big. And so that's what they do. They're basically pixel doubling. So what would normally be represented by 1 pixel gets represented by 4, because it's doubled in both directions. And so then it becomes this amazingly clear screen, but it's the same thing that you kind of had before, but now they just sort of made these high resolution screens available to you, but they look sharp, but things aren't tiny.
Do they like selectively double, so they're not doubling like videos or things like that?
Well, they actually are. So like basically, like if you're in web development, when you say something that is 600 pixels wide, and it's, they call them 600 CSS pixels, and on a Retina screen, it's actually technically 1200 pixels wide, but it's being treated within that framework as a 600 pixel screen. So it's like, it's actually using twice as many pixels in each direction as it says it is, basically. Or some other multiplier, depending on what you've got it set for.
Any other questions?
Oh, God.
So you had this one slide with all the different web tools. Why do you prefer that over just using Photoshop, Illustrator, whatever?
Oh, so like, you mean like when I would say things like, you can use these different tools? Well, for example, for clipping out the background on something, I find Photoshop doesn't do it as well as, for example, Clipping Magic. For vectorizing things, I find Illustrator doesn't do it as well as Vector Magic. I find working with GIFs in Photoshop to be painful. And it's not super easy to convert a video into a GIF in like Photoshop, and EasyGIF does it really easily, and you don't have to pay for it. Those things you also have to pay for, and all these things are free. I'm trying to think of another tool that I recommended that there's a few, free being one of the big ones, and then sometimes it's just because they do it better. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Get back to that.
There was one more question.
Yeah, we had 2 over there. Oh.
I was wondering.
Let's start front, and then we'll go back.
Okay. I was wondering. I've been seeing like WebM a lot.
WebM. Oh, I think that's a video format, right?
It is okay.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing, I don't remember. I'm guessing it's something that Google developed.
Yeah.
WebP stands for picture and WebM stands for movie.
I just never really thought about it until this talk. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not actually sure, but I'm guessing that's what it is. And your question?
That was actually my same question.
Oh! Okay. Done. All right.
The question was lazy loaded. Any other questions?
Okay.
So I remember reading a while ago that on mobile devices, if you use SVGs for icons or whatever, you get like a performance penalty, and you might like decrease battery life because it's more expensive computationally to run SVGs. Is that still an issue now? Because I think this data is like really heavy.
And Did that mean in native applications or in the web?
On the web.
I don't know, actually. In my experience, it has not been an issue. I mean, it certainly was an issue when they weren't all supported. Like, even just a couple of years ago, it wasn't supported on Android. But I guess it depends on the SVG, too. But I don't know the full answer to that question. Yeah, that's for the next time.
Any other questions? Nope. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Everyone got